Mysticism, a study in nature and development of spiritual consciousness by Evelyn Underhill. First half of Part 2, Chapter 9. The Dark Night of the Soul. We have wandered during the last few chapters from our study of the mystical life process in man, the organic growth of his transcendental consciousness, in order to examine the byproducts of that process, its characteristic forms of self-expression, the development of its normal art of contemplation, and the visions and voices, ecstasies and raptures, which are frequent, though not essential, accompaniments of its activity. But the mystic, like other persons of genius, is man first and artist afterwards. We shall make a grave though common mistake if we forget this and allow ourselves to be deflected from our study of his growth in personality by the wonder and interest of his art. Being, not doing, is the first aim of the mystic, and hence should be the first interest of the student of mysticism. We have considered for convenience sake all the chief forms of mystical activity at the halfway house of the transcendental life. But these activities are not, of course, peculiar to any one stage of that life. Ecstasy, for instance, is as common a feature of mystical conversion as of the last crisis, or mystic marriage of the soul, whilst visions and voices, in selves of a visionary or auditive type, accompany and illustrate every phase of the inward development. They lighten and explain the trials of purgation as often as they express the joys of illumination, and frequently mark the crisis of transition from one mystic state to the next. One exception, however, must be made to this rule. The most intense period of that great swing back into darkness, which usually divides the first mystic life, or illuminative way, from the second mystic life, or unitive way, is generally a period of utter blankness and stagnation, so far as mystical activity is concerned. The dark night of the soul, once fully established, is seldom lit by visions or made homely by voices. It is of the essence of its miseries that the once possessed power of horizon or contemplation now seems wholly lost. The self is tossed back from its hard-won point of vantage. Impotence, blankness, solitude are the epithets by which those immersed in this dark fire of purification describe their pains. It is this period in the life history of the mystic type to which we have now come. We have already noticed the chief psychological characteristics of all normal mystical development. We have seen that its essence consists in the effort to establish a new equilibrium, to get, as it were, a firm foothold upon transcendent levels of reality, and that in its path towards this consummation, the self experiences a series of oscillations between states of pleasure and states of pain. Put in another way, it is an orderly movement of the whole consciousness towards higher centres, in which each intense and progressive affirmation fatigues the immature's transcendental powers, and is paid for by a negation, a swing back of the whole consciousness, a stagnation of intellect, a reaction of the emotions, or an inhibition of the will. Thus the exalted consciousness of divine perfection, which the self acquired in its mystical awakening, was balanced by a depressed and bitter consciousness of its own inherent imperfection, and the clash of these two perceptions spurred it to that laborious effort of commendation which constitutes the purgative way. The renewed and ecstatic awareness of the Absolute which resulted, and which was the governing characteristic of illumination, brought its own proper negation, the awareness, that is to say, of the self's continued separation from, and incompatibility with, that Absolute which it has perceived. During the time in which the illuminated consciousness is fully established, the self, as a rule, is perfectly content, believing that in its vision of eternity, its intense and loving consciousness of God, it has reached the goal of its quest. Sooner or later, however, psychic fatigue sets in. The state of illumination begins to break up. The complementary negative consciousness appears, and shows itself as an overwhelming sense of darkness and deprivation. This sense is so deep and strong that it inhibits all consciousness of the transcendent, and plunges the self into the state of negation and misery which is called the dark night. We may look at the dark night, as at most other incidents of the mystic way, from 2 points of view. 1. We may see it with the psychologist, as a moment in the history of mental development, governed by the more or less mechanical laws which so conveniently explain to him the psychic life of man. Or, too, with the mystic himself, we may see it in its spiritual aspect as contributing to the remaking of character, the growth of the new man, his transmutation in God. Psychologically considered, the dark night is an example of the operation of the law of reaction from stress. It is a period of fatigue and lassitude following a period of sustained mystical activity. It is one of the best established laws of the nervous system, says Starbuck, that it has periods of exhaustion if exercised continuously in one direction, and can only recuperate by having a period of rest. However spiritual he may be, the mystic, so long as he is in the body, cannot help using the machinery of his nervous and cerebral system in the course of his adventures. His development on its psychic side consists in the taking over of this machinery, the capture of its centres of consciousness, in the interests of his growing transcendental life. In so far, then, as this is so, that transcendental life will be partly conditioned by psychic necessities and amenable to the laws of reaction and of fatigue. Each great step forward will entail lassitude and exhaustion for that mental machinery which he has pressed unto service and probably overworked. When the higher centres have been submitted to the continuous strain of a developed, illuminated life, with its accompanying periods of intense fervour, lucidity, deep contemplation, perhaps of visionary and auditive phenomena, the swing back into the negative state occurs almost of necessity. This is the psychological explanation of those strange and painful episodes in the lives of great saints, indeed of many spiritual persons hardly to be classed as saints, when, perhaps after a long life passed in faithful correspondence with the transcendental order, growing consciousness of the presence of God, the whole inner experience is suddenly swept away, and only a blind reliance on past conviction saves them from unbelief. The great contemplatives, those destined to attain the full stature of the mystic, emerge from this period of destitution, however long and drastic it may be, as from a new purification. It is for them the gateway to a higher state. But persons of a less heroic spirituality, if they enter the night at all, may succumb to its dangers and pains. The great negation is the sorting-house of the spiritual life. Here we part from the nature mystics, the mystic poets, and all who shared in and were contented with the illuminated vision of reality. Those who go on are the great and strong spirits, who do not seek to know, but are driven to be. We are to expect, then, as a part of the conditions under which human consciousness appears to work, that for every affirmation of the mystic life, there will be a negation waiting for the unstable self. Progress in contemplation, for instance, is marked by just such an alternation of light and shade, at first between consolation and aridity, then between dark contemplation and sharp intuitions of reality. So, too, in selves of extreme nervous instability, each joyous ecstasy entails a painful or negative ecstasy. The states of darkness and illumination coexist over a long period, alternating sharply and rapidly. Many seers and artists pay in this way, by agonizing periods of impotence and depression, for each violent outburst of creative energy. Rapid oscillations between a joyous and a painful consciousness seem to occur most often at the beginning of a new period of the mystic way, between purgation and illumination, and again between illumination and the dark night. For these mental states are, as a rule, gradually not abruptly established. Mystics call such oscillations the game of love in which God plays, as it were, hide-and-seek with the questing soul.